You know, those after-school specials that we all grew up with,
Yeah.
the ones that really hammered in that whole stranger danger thing.
Oh, totally.
Turns out
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what we thought we knew about keeping our kids safe,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to this whole human trafficking thing,
Right.
might be more myth than reality.
It's really interesting.
And with Sound of Freedom, like blowing up at the box
Oh,
office,
yeah, it's huge.
these anxieties are hitting a lot closer to home for a lot of us,
Absolutely. Especially with your
especially those of us,
parents, grandparents.
yeah, with kids and grandkids.
Exactly.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into the
Yeah.
world of human trafficking.
Absolutely.
We'll be checking out the claims from Sound of Freedom
Right.
and comparing those to what the experts are saying.
That's right. We'll be hearing from sociologists, prosecutors, researchers,
Wow.
even sex workers themselves.
Oh, wow. So we're really getting all sides of this.
Absolutely. We really want to paint a full picture here.
Yeah. Awesome. So it's all about getting a clear perspective,
Yeah.
dipping the fear and getting some real knowledge.
Exactly. And hopefully helping you become a more informed advocate.
Love that.
Yeah.
So let's kick things off by talking about Sound of Freedom itself.
Okay. Sounds good.
The movie basically follows this Homeland Security agent, Tim Ballard,
Right.
who goes rogue to rescue kids from these international sex trafficking rings.
Pretty intense stuff.
I think Liam Neeson in Taken, but with this like religious twist.
Oh, interesting.
And the film really goes all out with the drama,
Oh, yeah.
kidnappings, conspiracies, the heroic protagonist, the whole 9 yards.
I mean, it makes for a compelling story, but does it really reflect how trafficking works in the real world?
That's the big question, right?
Exactly.
And there's this one scene right at the beginning that always sticks with me.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
Ballard actually befriends a pedophile to infiltrate a trafficking ring.
Whoa.
So it makes you wonder, is that a tactic that's actually used in real investigations?
Yeah, and is it really that straightforward?
Right, because the movie makes it seem so cut and dry.
Exactly. There's a lot more nuance to it than that.
Absolutely. And it kind of plays into that whole stranger danger myth.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Preying on that fear that someone's going to snatch our kids off the street.
It's a primal fear, for sure.
And we see it everywhere in the media all the time.
Absolutely.
Like, remember that story Cindy McCain told
Oh, yeah.
about the kid at the airport?
Yeah, she thought she'd stumbled onto a trafficking situation just because the kid and the adult were different races.
It's crazy how our biases can distort our perceptions.
It really is, and it's something we need to be mindful of, especially when talking about such a sensitive issue.
For sure. And then there's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC as they're known.
Right.
They're often cited in these discussions about trafficking. But their methods for calculating statistics have been questioned.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, like if a parent calls their hotline and says they're worried their kid might be trafficked, that kid gets labeled a potential trafficking victim, even if they come home safe a few hours later.
So the data might not be as reliable as we think.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a reminder that numbers can be misleading, especially when they're being used to push a specific narrative.
Absolutely. We got to be careful about taking statistics at face value.
For sure. And, Sound of Freedom really leans into these maybe inflated numbers.
Okay.
And all that dramatic imagery of kids being kidnapped and shipped off in containers.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. But how much truth is there to it?
Well, there's this King County prosecutor who specializes in trafficking cases.
Okay.
And he says he's never seen a case involving little kids being trafficked internationally like that.
Really?
And it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
Those international rings are incredibly risky and complex.
So why go through all that trouble?
Exactly, when there are plenty of vulnerable people to exploit right here.
It's like ordering takeout when you've got a fridge full of food.
Huh.
Why go to all that extra effort?
Right.
And another statistic that gets thrown around a lot is that 1 in 7 runaways are victims of trafficking.
I have heard that one.
That actually came from NCMEC.
Oh, wow.
But the Washington Post called them out on their methodology.
What ad?
And they had to add the word likely.
Oh, so it's not as definitive as it sounds.
Nope. And it makes you wonder what other info is being presented without the full context.
It's concerning for sure. We need to be really critical of the information we're consuming.
Absolutely. So if these dramatic scenarios aren't the norm, what does the reality of trafficking actually look like?
That's where we need to move away from the Hollywood version and focus on the real experiences of those affected.
Right.
While those international kidnapping rings do exist,
Yeah.
most trafficking, especially involving minors, stems from much more insidious factors.
Eloquent.
Things like domestic abuse, poverty, lack of resources.
So it's not always about some creepy stranger in a van.
Not necessarily. It can be much more subtle,
Yeah.
someone gradually chipping away at a person's agency until they're trapped.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
And it highlights the importance of addressing the root causes of exploitation, not just the sensationalized stories.
Absolutely. We need to look beyond the surface and understand the systemic factors that make people vulnerable in the first place.
Right. And that brings us to this high-profile case that initially seemed like a clear-cut example of international trafficking.
Okay, which one?
The Robert Kraft case.
Oh, yeah, the New England Patriots owner.
That's the one. Early reports made it sound like there were all these women brought from China against their will.
Right.
But those reports turned out to be false.
Oh, wow.
None of the women were from China. They were all living in the U.S. and had responded to job ads.
So it wasn't the international slavery ring everyone thought it was?
Nope. Now, were their working conditions exploitative?
Yeah, that's possible.
Absolutely. But it wasn't as straightforward as the media initially portrayed it.
It shows how easily media narratives can shape public perception.
And even influence policy decisions.
Right. We need to be really careful about jumping to conclusions.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, what narratives are we quick to believe and why?
Yeah. Are we more likely to accept stories that fit our existing biases, even if they lack evidence?
Those are some tough questions, but they're important ones to ask.
Absolutely, if we want to have an honest and productive conversation about trafficking.
So let's talk about the term trafficking itself,
Okay.
because it's evolved a lot over time.
It has kind of like those stretchy pants you wore in high school that somehow still fit.
Love that analogy.
Right.
It perfectly describes how the definition of trafficking has expanded to include a much wider range of activities.
It's got a really broad.
And it's blurring the lines between forced labor and situations that might not fit our traditional idea of slavery.
It's definitely a complex issue.
Back in the early 1900s, trafficking was pretty much synonymous with white slavery,
Interesting.
reflecting the racial anxieties of the time.
Makes sense.
Like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was fueled by this moral panic about Chinese women being trafficked for sex.
So those fears and biases have been baked into the concept of trafficking from the beginning.
It seems like it.
Yeah, and even as the definition broadened to include all races and genders,
Yeah.
those underlying anxieties about sexuality and control didn't disappear.
So how did we go from white slavery to the much broader definition we use today?
And what are the implications of that shift?
Right, because now we're talking about modern-day slavery.
That's right. And while that term might fit some situations,
Mhm.
using it too broadly can actually dilute its impact and obscure the unique horrors of historical chattel slavery.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike.
It is.
Acknowledging the severity of exploitation without trivializing the suffering of those who endured chattel slavery. So how do we use language responsibly while still addressing the very real problem of exploitation?
That's a great question, and one we'll dig into deeper as we continue this deep dive.
Sounds good.
We'll explore the unintended consequences of these broad definitions, look at the ethical dilemmas of anti-trafficking work, and discuss alternative approaches that prioritize the experiences of those most affected.
I'm really looking forward to unpacking all of that.
Me too. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
So if these dramatic scenarios aren't the norm, what does the reality of trafficking actually look like?
That's where we need to shift from the Hollywood version to the lived experiences of those affected.
Right.
While international kidnapping rings certainly exist,
Yeah.
the vast majority of trafficking cases, particularly those involving minors, stem from more insidious and often overlooked factors.
Like what?
Factors like domestic abuse, poverty, and a lack of resources.
It's about recognizing that vulnerability doesn't always come in the form of a shadowy figure lurking in a van.
Exactly.
It can be much more subtle and insidious, gradually chipping away at someone's agency until they're trapped in a situation they feel powerless to escape.
That's a really important point.
And it makes me think about the story of that homeless woman in Portland.
Oh yeah, what happened to her?
She was struggling to survive, ended up in a relationship with an older man who pressured her into sex work.
That's awful.
It wasn't some stranger who kidnapped her. It was someone who exploited her vulnerability and desperation.
That's a heartbreaking example of how trafficking can be hidden in plain sight.
It really is. And it underscores the need to address the root causes, not just the dramatic scenarios that grab headlines.
Absolutely. We need to look beyond the surface and understand the systemic factors that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking in the first place.
Right, and that brings us to another high-profile case that initially seemed like a clear-cut example of international trafficking.
Okay, which one?
The Robert Kraft case.
Oh, yeah. The New England Patriots owner.
That's the one. Early reports made it sound like there were all these women brought from China against their will.
Right.
But those reports turned out to be false.
Oh, wow.
None of the women were from China. They were all living in the U.S. and had responded to job ads.
So it wasn't the international slavery ring everyone thought it was.
Nope. Now, were their working conditions exploitative?
Yeah, that's possible.
Absolutely. But it wasn't as straightforward as the media initially portrayed it,
It shows how easily media narratives can shape public perception.
and even influence policy decisions.
Right. We need to be really careful about jumping to conclusions.
Totally. And it begs the question, what narratives are we quick to believe and why?
Yeah. Are we more likely to accept stories that fit our existing biases, even if they lack evidence?
Those are some tough questions, but they're important ones to ask.
Absolutely, if we want to have an honest and productive conversation about trafficking.
So let's talk about the term trafficking itself,
Okay.
because it's evolved a lot over time.
It has kind of like those stretchy pants you wore in high school that somehow still fit.
Uh-huh. Love that analogy.
Right?
It perfectly describes how the definition of trafficking has expanded to include a much wider range of activities.
It got really broad.
And it's blurring the lines between forced labor and situations that might not fit our traditional idea of slavery.
It's definitely a complex issue.
Back in the early 1900s, trafficking was pretty much synonymous with white slavery,
Interesting.
reflecting the racial anxieties of the time.
Makes sense.
Like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was fueled by this moral panic
Right.
about Chinese women being trafficked for sex.
So those fears and biases have been baked into the concept of trafficking from the beginning.
It seems like it.
Yeah, and even as the definition broadened to include all races and genders,
Yeah.
those underlying anxieties about sexuality and control didn't disappear.
So how did we go from white slavery to the much broader definition we use today?
And what are the implications of that shift?
Right, because now we're talking about modern-day slavery.
That's right. And while that term might fit some situations, using it too broadly can actually dilute its impact and obscure the unique horrors of historical chattel slavery.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. Acknowledging the severity of exploitation without trivializing the suffering of those who endured chattel slavery. So how do we use language responsibly while still addressing the very real problem of exploitation?
That's a great question, and one we'll dig into deeper as we continue this deep dive.
That's good.
We'll explore the unintended consequences of these broad definitions, look at the ethical dilemmas of anti-trafficking work, and discuss alternative approaches that prioritize the experiences of those most affected.
I'm really looking forward to unpacking all of that.
Me too. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
So how do we strike that balance?
Yeah.
How do we use language responsibly
That's tough.
while still addressing the very real problem of exploitation?
Well, I think it starts with being specific about the types of exploitation we're talking about.
Right.
So instead of just saying modern-day slavery, we could say things like forced labor or debt bondage.
Right. Using more precise language to describe what's actually happening. Okay, I like that. And speaking of responses, there's been a lot of talk about the Nordic model
Oh, yeah.
as a way to combat trafficking.
That's right.
And on the surface, it sounds pretty good, aiming to criminalize the purchase of sex.
Reduced demand.
Yeah, but I've heard mixed things about its effectiveness.
Yeah, and the potential unintended consequences.
So what's the deal with the Nordic model?
Well, it definitely is a controversial approach.
Okay.
It's meant to protect sex workers by targeting the buyers.
Okay.
But some research suggests it might actually make sex work less safe
Really?
by driving it further underground.
Ah, you see.
When you push something into the shadows, you lose oversight, accountability.
And the ability to ensure the well-being of those involved.
Exactly.
So it's like a catch-22,
Kind of.
trying to protect sex workers,
Yeah.
but potentially putting them in more danger.
It's a difficult situation for sure.
And it makes sense if sex work is criminalized, those involved are less likely to report abuse or seek help.
Absolutely. They're afraid of the legal repercussions.
Right. And it's important to remember that many sex workers actually advocate for decriminalization,
They do.
which would allow for regulation support systems and safer working conditions.
It's about giving them agency and a voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it seems like listening to the voices of those most affected is crucial when creating policies.
Couldn't agree more. And it brings us back to that idea of shifting our focus from saving to helping.
I like that.
Instead of viewing trafficking solely through the lens of dramatic interventions and heroic rescues,
Yeah.
we need to address the underlying social and economic conditions that create vulnerability in the first place.
So less taken and more,
I know what you mean.
I hesitate to make a glib comparison here because the issue is so serious, but maybe more of a community-based approach.
I understand your hesitation. It's a sensitive topic.
But you're right, it's about shifting the focus from dramatic rescues to the less glamorous but essential work of addressing systemic inequalities.
Exactly.
So what would a helping approach look like in practice?
Well, there are many ways we can contribute to creating a safer and more equitable world.
Like what?
Supporting organizations that provide direct services to vulnerable individuals,
Okay.
advocating for policies that address issues like poverty and homelessness,
Right.
and educating ourselves and others about the complexities of trafficking.
Those are all great ideas.
And it's about challenging our own biases and assumptions, being mindful of the narratives we consume and the language we use.
Yeah, language has power.
It does.
And it's essential to use it responsibly, especially when talking about sensitive topics like exploitation.
Couldn't agree more.
And bringing it back to the Sound of Freedom,
Okay.
while it's definitely raised awareness about child trafficking,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to view it through a critical lens.
Not perfect.
Not at all. The film relies on a lot of myths and stereotypes, and its oversimplified portrayal of this complex issue can be misleading.
I see your point.
And one of the most concerning aspects is the film's call to action.
What do you mean?
It encourages viewers to spread awareness and buy tickets for others,
Okay.
implying that financial support equals saving children,
Right.
while raising awareness is important.
Absolutely.
It's crucial to understand that financial contributions alone won't solve this complex problem.
It's not a simple fix.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
That's a powerful analogy.
It might stop the bleeding temporarily, but you haven't addressed the underlying injury.
And that's what we need to focus on, the root causes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the question we need to grapple with.
Okay.
And it starts by recognizing that trafficking is not a monolithic issue.
Right.
It manifests in different forms, each with its own set of dynamics and
So
challenges.
there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope. We need to be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
It's about embracing the complexity, challenging our assumptions, and listening to the voices of those affected.
Exactly. And shifting our focus from saving to helping,
I like that.
from dramatic interventions to systemic change.
And from simplistic narratives to nuanced understanding.
You got it.
And remembering that real change takes time and effort.
It does.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. And while it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem,
Oh, yeah.
it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference.
Like what?
Educating ourselves, having open and honest conversations, supporting organizations that are doing good work on the ground.
So we can all contribute in our own way.
Absolutely. Every effort, no matter how small, contributes to the larger movement towards a more just and equitable world.
Well said. So what are some organizations that you would recommend?
One that comes to mind is Polaris.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
They operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline,
That's right.
and they have a ton of resources on their website.
Okay, cool. And they also advocate for policy changes
They do.
to address the systemic issues that lead to trafficking.
Exactly. They're doing great work.
Awesome.
Oh.
And I've also heard good things about the Reply All podcast episode that delves into the impact of Vossa Sesta.
Oh, yeah, that's a great episode.
Those laws were aimed at fighting online sex trafficking, but they ended up having some unintended consequences.
That's right. Vossa Sesta was meant to curb online platforms that facilitate sex trafficking,
Wow.
but it ended up pushing more sex workers into dangerous situations
Ow.
by limiting their online presence and communication.
So it made it harder for them to screen clients and work safely.
Exactly.
It's like they tried to solve a problem by pushing it further into the shadows.
And that often makes things worse.
Definitely. It just highlights how important it is to understand the complexities of an issue before making sweeping changes.
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
need to think things through and be open to adapting our approach as we learn more.
So education is key.
It really is.
The more we understand about trafficking,
Mm-hmm.
the better equipped we are to identify red flags and support effective solutions.
Couldn't agree more.
And remember, even seemingly small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Like educating ourselves, having open conversations, supporting organizations.
It all adds up.
We're all part of this larger ecosystem.
We are.
And even small shifts in awareness and behavior can ripple outward and create positive change.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Thanks. And it's not about waiting for some grand heroic moment.
Right.
Change often happens incrementally through collective effort and sustained commitment.
It's a team effort.
It really is.
Yeah,
So it sounds like education is a great place to start
it is.
if we want to make a real difference in the fight against trafficking.
Absolutely. The more we learn, the better equipped we are to make a positive impact.
Well said. So folks, if you're interested in learning more about human trafficking and how to help,
Yeah,
we'll be sure to include some resources in the show notes.
that's a great idea.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack the complexities of this issue and explore some alternative approaches.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. We've got a lot more to discuss.
Definitely. This is a topic that deserves our full attention
Absolutely.
and our commitment to making a real difference.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us today,
It's been a pleasure.
and stay tuned for more insightful discussions on the deep dive.
See you next time. So before the break, we were talking about how the definition of trafficking has changed over time,
Right.
and how that's led to some questions about using the term modern-day slavery.
You mentioned that this term can be problematic when applied too broadly.
Yeah, it's
Can you
tricky.
explain that a bit more?
Sure. So while some trafficking situations are absolutely horrific, and they might resemble historical slavery in some ways,
Okay.
it's important to remember that chattel slavery was a very specific system.
Right, like the legal ownership of human beings as property.
Exactly, which thankfully doesn't exist in most of the world today.
And by using modern-day slavery too loosely,
We risk downplaying the severity of historical chattel slavery.
yeah, and we might blur the lines between different types of exploitation.
Exactly. So how can we make sure we're using language responsibly
Good question.
to accurately reflect the severity of exploitation while also respecting the historical context?
Well, I think it starts with being more specific about the types of exploitation we're talking about.
Okay, I like that.
Instead of just saying modern-day slavery,
Yeah,
we could say forced labor or debt bondage,
right.
depending on the situation.
Using more precise language helps us understand the specific dynamics at play.
And tailor our responses accordingly.
Exactly.
Speaking of responses, there's been a lot of talk about the Nordic model.
Oh, yeah, as a way to combat trafficking.
Right on the surface, it sounds really progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Criminalizing the purchase of sex to reduce demand.
Right.
But I've heard mixed things about how well it actually works.
And the potential unintended consequences.
So what's the deal with the Nordic model?
Well, it's definitely controversial.
Okay.
The idea is to protect sex workers by going after the buyers.
Okay.
But some research suggests it might actually make sex work less safe
Really? How so?
by driving it further underground.
I see.
When you force something into the shadows.
You lose transparency and accountability.
Exactly. And it becomes harder to ensure the well-being of those involved.
It's a tricky situation for sure. And it makes sense.
Yeah.
If sex work is illegal,
People are less likely to report abuse or seek help.
right, because they're afraid of getting in trouble with the law.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that many sex workers actually advocate for decriminalization.
So they can work more openly and safely.
Exactly.
It seems like listening to the people who are directly affected is so important
Couldn't agree more.
when we're trying to create effective policies.
It's crucial. And it brings us back to that idea of shifting our focus from saving to helping.
I like that.
Instead of just thinking about dramatic rescues,
Right.
we need to address the underlying social and economic conditions that make people vulnerable to trafficking in the first place.
So less taken and more,
I know what you mean. It's hard to find the right analogy.
because it's such a serious issue. But maybe more of like a community-based approach focused on support and empowerment.
I think that's a good way to put it.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, there are many things we can do to create a safer and more equitable world.
Like what?
We can support organizations that provide direct services to vulnerable individuals. We can
Okay.
advocate for policies that address issues like poverty and homelessness.
Right.
And we can educate ourselves and others about the complexities of trafficking.
Those are all great ideas.
Yeah,
And I think it's also important to examine our own biases
absolutely.
and be mindful of the stories we consume and the language we use.
Language has power.
It really does. And we need to use it responsibly, especially when talking about sensitive issues like exploitation.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's bring it back to Sound of Freedom.
Okay.
Well, it's definitely raised awareness about child trafficking.
It has.
It's important to be critical of it, too.
Right. It's not perfect.
It relies on a lot of myths and stereotypes,
Mm-hmm.
and it presents a very simplified view of a complex issue.
I see your point.
And one of the things that concerns me most is the film's call to action.
What do you mean?
It encourages people to spread awareness and buy tickets for others,
Okay.
implying that if you just give money, you're saving children.
Right.
And while raising awareness is important,
Absolutely.
it's important to remember that throwing money at the problem isn't a solution in itself.
It's more complicated than that.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Uh-huh. I like that.
You might stop the bleeding for a little bit, but you haven't dealt with a real injury.
And that's what we need to focus on, addressing the root causes.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. How do we channel all this energy and concern into effective action?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that trafficking isn't just one thing.
Right.
It takes many different forms, each with its own unique challenges.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And we should be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
It's about being willing to embrace the complexity
And challenge our assumptions.
and listen to the people who are actually affected by trafficking.
Exactly. We need to shift our focus from saving to helping.
I like that.
From dramatic interventions to systemic change.
From simple narratives to a more nuanced understanding.
Got it.
And remember that real change takes time and effort.
It does. There's no quick fix.
While it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem,
Oh, yeah, I get that.
we can all do something to make a difference.
Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Like what?
Educating ourselves, having open and honest conversations, supporting organizations that are doing good work.
So we're all part of this larger effort.
We are, and every little bit helps.
So we've talked about moving away from those dramatic interventions and towards a more nuanced understanding of trafficking
Right.
and the systemic issues that contribute to it.
Exactly.
But for those of us who want to take action, where do we even start?
Well, one of the most effective things you can do is support organizations that are doing good work on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense. But with so many organizations out there, how do we know which ones are actually making a difference?
That's a great question. It's really important to do your research.
Okay.
Look for organizations with a proven track record,
Okay.
transparency in their practices, and a commitment to using evidence-based approaches.
So not just relying on those sensationalized stories
Right.
or using vulnerable people as props for fundraising.
Exactly.
Exploitation can be disguised as help.
It can.
So we need to be
Yeah.
really careful.
Absolutely. One organization I recommend checking out is Polaris.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline,
Okay,
and they have a ton of resources on their website.
great. And they also advocate for policy changes
They do.
to address the root causes of trafficking.
That's right. They're doing some really important work.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I've also heard good things about that Reply All podcast episode.
Oh, yeah, the one about FOSTA SESTA.
Yeah, those laws were supposed to combat online sex trafficking.
Right.
But they ended up having some unintended consequences.
Yeah, they did. FOSTA SESTA was meant to go after websites that facilitate sex trafficking,
Okay.
but it actually ended up making things more dangerous for sex workers
How's
by limiting their online presence,
Okay.
making it harder for them to communicate.
So it made it more difficult for them to screen clients and work safely.
Exactly.
It seems like they were trying to solve one problem, but ended up creating another.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how well-intentioned efforts can backfire.
If they're not based on a solid understanding of the issue.
Exactly. And it shows why it's so important to really think things through.
And to be willing to adapt our approach as we learn more.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like education is crucial.
It really is.
The more we learn about the nuances of trafficking
the better equipped we'll be to identify those red flags.
and to support solutions that actually work.
Couldn't agree more.
And it's not just about big organizations and policy changes.
Right.
We can all do our part.
Even small actions can make a difference.
Like what?
Like educating ourselves.
Okay.
Having open and honest conversations about these issues.
And supporting organizations that are doing good work in our communities.
It all adds up.
So we're all part of this effort to create a safer world.
We are.
And even those small shifts in awareness and behavior can have a ripple effect.
You got it. It's not about waiting for some grand, heroic moment.
It's about the everyday actions we take.
Exactly. Change often happens incrementally through collective effort and sustained commitment.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
It has.
We've debunked some common myths.
Yeah.
Explored the history of trafficking.
And looked at different approaches and their limitations.
But most importantly, we've highlighted the need for nuanced understanding.
And informed action.
If there's one key takeaway from our conversation, It's that trafficking is a complex issue,
It is.
and there's no easy fix.
It requires critical thinking
Challenging our assumptions.
and a commitment to addressing the root causes of exploitation.
So let's ditch the sensationalized narratives and the hero complexes.
And focus on real solutions.
Solutions that address the systemic factors that make people vulnerable to trafficking.
That's a vision worth working towards.
Absolutely.
Mm,
And remember, knowledge is power.
it is.
The more we learn, the better equipped we are to make a difference.
Couldn't agree more.
So if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive
Yeah.
for more nuanced explorations of the topics that matter
We'll help you cut through the noise.
and gain a deeper understanding of the world around us.
Until next time.
Keep those brains buzzing.